Hi, everyone. I'll give you a moment to connect to sound. Hello and welcome to the Broken Rails 1173rd New Social Environment. I'm Min, the Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Katie Long, James Loop, Alice Yang, Matvei Yankelevich, and Cole Swensen. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. James Loop is the author of several chapbooks, most recently Mezzogiorno, and co-author with Claire DeVoogd of a play Appletini. His work has been published in The Broken Rail, Hot Pink, Hyperallergic, Lambda Literary, and Prelude. He currently works as the publicity director for World Poetry, and his debut book of poetry is forthcoming from Winter Editions in 2026. Katie Long is a writer and translator, a creative writing MFA candidate at Columbia University. She is currently translating Ariana Atala's Cobello Glaciar and Marta Lynch's Los Dedos de la Mano. She is development director at World Poetry. Alice Yang is a translator and PhD student in the French department at Yale. She holds a BA in Literature and Comparative Cultures from Yale and an MA in French Literature from École Normale Supérieure de Lyon. Alice's first book of translations, Abounding Freedom by Julian Grog, was published by World Poetry Books in May of 2024. In the late 1990s, Matvei Yankelevich co-founded Ugly Duckling Press. Since 2022, he is the editor of World Poetry, and in 2023, he founded the small press Winter Edition. He has received fellowships from the NEA, the NEH, New York Fine Arts, and Civitella Ranieri, and teaches translation at Columbia University School of the Arts. He is the author of several books and chapbooks, including Dead Winter from Phonograph Editions. And our host today, Cole Swensen, is the author of 20 volumes of poetry, most recently And, which was longlisted for the Griffin Poetry Prize, and a collection of critical essays, Noise That Stays Noise. A book of hybrid poem essays, Art in Time, was published by Nightboat in 2021. A former Guggenheim Fellow, she has been a finalist and recipient of multiple awards for her poetry. She has also translated over 20 volumes of poetry, prose, and art criticism from French, and won the 2024 Alta National Translation Award and the 2025 Stephen Mitchell Translation Award. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Cole.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for giving us your time today. We're really looking forward to this conversation. Publishing in Transit is a monthly series that celebrates the people who produce poetry, who get poetry out to the public through small presses or organizations and programming. And we thank them all because they're often giving up their writing time in order to bring poetry to other people. We'd like to start with poetry itself. And so we're going to start with James, and a reading from you will be really welcome.
Thanks. Thanks, Cole. Thanks to the Rail team for having us. I'm going to start with a short reading from a book called The Cheapest France in Town by Sajung Hak, a contemporary Korean poet, translated by Megan Sung-yoon. It's a debut translation, which is something that we specialize in and are proud of. I'm going to read two short poems from here. And then, because Cole has graciously invited us to also be our writer selves as well as our publisher selves in the space, I'm going to read a couple of my poems. So this first poem kind of functions as a sort of foreword to the book. It's called Poet's Word. Strangely, life continues without being edited, contracted, anchored. Quite a few years have passed, and I think it's strange, but it is indeed strange. Sometimes I wonder why it's so strange. How does everyone realize that this very moment in their lives is their life's highlight while living it? Here, there's no background music, special effects, plot, or anything at all. It's just strange. The value of this book is at present the same as the lowest online exclusive price for a half box of 30 Shin instant noodles, though Shin would be slightly cheaper if you paid with a rewards card. A careful comparison of prices before buying may be a great help to your life. And this one is called Instant Love Mix. Having learned that it could be used in 3 minutes after adding water, I ripped open the packet with shaking hands. It was getting cold, and I was soaked, so there was no other option. Some had excited faces, some had doubt, and some had their backs turned to me, as if uninterested, but everyone's eyes were on the packet in my hand. Love flamed up in 3 minutes like a campfire stacked up to the height of a person. Some said the instant stuff would die out soon, but it didn't die that easily and turned out to be quite useful. Alas, isn't love just that to begin with? Quick to flare, quick to extinguish. Sitting in a huddle, their faces brightened. Luckily, there were a few more bags in the paper box I was supplied with, and barely able to bring. The night is distant, and we open the packets, one by one, and add water. Why? Don't ask why. We don't love each other. We know love isn't like that. That's why we're well aware that the right answer in this case is to add water to the finely ground love and wait a bit. And we also already know that's that. A flame, all these sappy faces are for 3 minutes. This is a very, very short poem of mine called Universal Ad. Sometimes it's just time for a little something. And this is a poem called Roy. I like the milky quality of light in November. I like to think I'm the Roy Orbison of average American gay men. Neo-Nazis are marching in Columbus. I express a second coffee through its shining tin pod. Return to the poem. Who does the work gets the work done. Who flees it suffers and is antic and/or morose. Roy Orbison triumphs when my heart heaves to crying. I was all right for a while. I could smile for a while. Can we see the Sienese painting show, in which long scattered segments of admired altarpieces have been reunited for the first time on our continent? Tambours and timbrels of luscious color, bent to grave themes. I want to, but I can't on Monday. How are the cantons of Switzerland faring? Glacial shrinkage and rightward drift? Does Canton neighbor Columbus? Is that where he thought he was going? 45 pro-democracy activists have been sentenced to jail in Hong Kong. In Guangzhou, a Spaniard in soft, thin pants sliced me a tomato 12 years ago in a dark kitchen whose window opened onto a thundering 12-lane highway, as erotic as it sounds. And now I'll introduce Alice Yang. Alice Yang's translations have appeared in Asymptote, Two Lines, The Yale Review, and Agni. I never say that out loud. Agni. A-G-N-Y, A-G-N-I, I don't know. Her first book of translation published by World Poetry last spring is the celebrated French novelist Julien Grac's only book of poetry, Abounding Freedom. Patrick Modiano noted Grac's profound attention to landscapes and topographies, to what might be called the spirit of places. In the words of Richard Seaberth, Alice Yang has beautifully registered the groove and gyre of Grac's prose poetry as nobody before. Please welcome Alice.
Great. Thank you so much, James. So I'm going to read 3 poems, and as James said, these are prose poems. So this first poem, I think, gives a good idea of what got called the singular silence of the present hour. A hibernator. In the morning upon waking, the double windows imprisoned him in their virgin forest, a delicate palm grove of ice. It was only a question of watering those windows for the forest to grow in a single night. One would hardly be surprised, however, to find oneself walking upside down. The sky was nothing but gray, dirty loam, though the Milky Way of snow lit the world below. Every face was beautiful, rejuvenated. The snow bore glorious bodies. At noon, in the garden of snow and cotton wool, standing on one foot and holding his breath, he retuned the silence In the evening, the fleecy labyrinth of fog secured the house. The doors were left swinging. Then the moonbeam prowled round the room till the window set a large black cross on the bed. Such delicate luminous ruses, however, weren't always without danger. Oh, this next poem gives you an idea of Bach's love of seascapes and the idea of setting sail. Elective affinities. A grand palace with cloudy corridors, golden rays and mist ahead, the sun's morning plainsong above blankets of fog broken by the tips of lighthouses, a perpetual November of singing showers, of lost birds clearing the open sea with a single cry. Behind it, a lawn with an aviary and a view of a gasometer. I'd retire there for weeks, for leisurely vacations, indulgent excursions, intimate conversations, endless as a game of mirrors or an optical illusion. The winding coastal roads yielded to that special light of tide-beaten monuments. The only furnishings were sextants, meridian spheres, bent astrolabes, and, in general, anything that might cast doubt on the oppressive forecast for a course of days that conforms too well to the seasonal signs. On days glaring with sunlight, a tapestry of mist spread across the spars. Above the moldings, the three-masted windjammers' lovely laundered sails hung out to dry, a host of ghostly velum clouds, batiste heavy as brocade. And, bulging, hefty, enormous as the hull, a varnished wardrobe from which the fine weather's giant shrouds spring forth, the palace sets sail between planets in an ether pregnant with white teats, a cumulus of canvas, a flapping white maelstrom, the great indecency of letting bridal veils fall. And this third poem finds the poets drifting along the river. Moses. Eyes closed under fresh privet leaves, the water path carried me backwards every afternoon like a pale Ophelia in her buoy of flowers, the waves slowly dissolving the soft enclosures. I lay on the elemental pillow, lower than any other living creature, the aspect of trees falling on me like the dew of a face leaning over a sick bed, and setting the world sweetly afloat on my path like a cork, I was betrothed to the bridge's resounding rings like gauze, level with the harmless muzzles of cows. The forest's shadow on the river mixed the black water with a sweet tisane of dead leaves and forgetfulness. Noon found me drifting on the sunlit sea, a vast scintillating shores, hands closed over my heart, eyelids bursting with languor, as the reed's sumptuous rustling ate away at the banks of a theatrical hedge of murmurs, and, gently entangled in the stalks like a dress with long trains, numbed in the depths of a green dead end, I was carried by the water like a belly, the sweet nets of sunlight descending over me like a man gazing into the depths of a well, unraveling over a woman's face. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great start, both of you. Thanks. Let's start with you, Alice, to hear about your experience. It was your first publication, book-length publication, and we'd love to hear how it went, what drew you to CRAC, what drew you to world poetry.
Yeah, sure. So I discovered CRAC when I was in college in 2017. I was in France. I was working in France that summer, and I'd asked someone who his favorite writer was, and he immediately said CRAC. So I wrote his name down, and I kind of forgot about it. But then I took a translation workshop class, and I had to do a final project, and so I remembered CRAC's name and went to the library, got one of his books, a book of short prose pieces, and I just started reading and was just spellbound by these really beautiful descriptions of landscape. And I I really like Baroque prose, prose that's kind of dense. And yeah, so I was just really drawn to that aspect. And so I decided to translate this short prose piece called The Road, or La Route, for my final project for this class. And it's actually included as a sort of coda in this book. And then I decided to continue translating CRAC. And so I translated this particular collection for my senior project, actually. So I was really lucky to have had a lot of amazing professors and mentors. And so I had this manuscript at the end of my senior year, and then I kind of purposely forgot about it and went back to it with fresh eyes and edited. My French was better. I was living in France, and I started submitting to journals. Was lucky to have had some of my translations published, and one of those journals was Mezzogiorno, which is run by Austin Carter. And Austin really liked my translations, and he was like, "Oh, I think Matvei would like these translations." So he sent these translations to Matvei, and Matvei, I guess you liked the translations, and you. So I sent Matvei a book proposal and a longer sample translation, and I don't remember the exact timeline, but I think things moved pretty quickly from there. I mean, you responded pretty quickly. You said you wanted to do the book. We had a meeting on Zoom, and then I signed the contract, and yeah, that's how it all started. And I remember the process being pretty smooth. I definitely felt supported every step along the way. I thought I could, ask any and every question whenever I wanted. And I mean, I just feel really lucky that I was able to publish my first book of translations with World Poetry, because everyone is so wonderful and generous and patient especially as I made like extremely last minute edits. And I guess one thing that I was surprised by and really appreciated is that you all really trusted me and trusted my judgment, which was kind of scary, but which I think I also really needed as an emerging translator for, some confidence. So thank you.
Thank you. Great. I'd love to hear from the rest of the crew, Matvei, Katie, James. What was your role in this book and your role in general in the press? And maybe we'll start with Matvei. You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, indeed, I had a role to play, though I think Alice did really the lion's share of the work with this book. Like Alice said, and I do get recommendations from friends at different journals or just translators, people who teach translation or know somebody, and I tend to look closely at things that get sent my way. But we do have a proposal process, and I like to see that people can write about the writer they're translating, as much as to see that they're also translating in a way that's compelling. So and Alice certainly could do both. And we worked quite a bit on the introduction. And so my role, I mean, I'm the editor of the press. I'm also kind of de facto the managing editor, the production manager, the bookkeeper. I do a few other things too. I guess I'm a kind of small nonprofit jack of all trades, executive director kind of person. So, or that's my role here. So, as we're quite a small team. In fact, Katie just came on last spring, around the time this book was being published. So, so we were just James and I and some contractors who I hire to help with editing or copy editing, proofreading. Of course, our designer, who we should mention, Andrew Bourne, who did an amazing job with this book of Alice's, and generally with our whole new redesign a couple of years ago. When I took over, I started to work with Andrew to create a sort of, a series look for our books, and create something also flexible. And this was sort of the first time we really did a book with a kind of almost a facsimile style nod to an original cover. I guess we did a similar thing with the Jaguri book, which we'll see later. But Andrew did an amazing job with the typography. He's kind of a type nerd and type historian, amateur type historian. So we made the book look a lot like the original. I think it's Edition Corti. Is it?
Yeah.
And what can I say? I mean, there's lots I can tell you about what I do at World Poetry, but maybe we'll get to that, I'm sure. But that's the basics, and of course, coordinating. I should say that my job, if for anyone who thinks like, oh, I'd like to go into editing, it's like most of my editorial job is correspondence, is moving things from person to person, getting everything sorted out, talking to people, talking to people who might help the book along, blurbers, reviewers, etc. James does a lot of that as well. But really about conversation with the translator, getting the rights, all of these things. So editing is very pleasurable, and can be and requires tons of concentration. It's I very much enjoy it, and I wish I had more time for it. But the reality is that editing is actually a kind of smaller percentage of my time than I would like it to be. Yeah.
Thanks. And James, what do you do?
Yeah, good question. I'm the publicist. I'm the publicity director for World Poetry. So the process with Alice's book was fairly typical. The books come out in roughly 2 batches per year. There's a spring season and a fall season. So around the time that the manuscript is being finalized and gotten toward the printer, at least, I come in contact with the project and I make a press release and I get it up on our website. And I work with a great social media manager named Leslie Olivo to plan our publicity in that space. It's my job to make sure that people who might be interested in the book have a moment of contact with the book. So I think something kind of distinct, at least in my experience in small press publishing about World Poetry, is that we combine generally a kind of a small press ethos, certainly in terms of the number of people who work for the company, with like a pretty robust publicity operation. We have a large database of contacts, and we really make every effort to get the book out, which is something that a lot of small presses, just due to limited resources, can sometimes struggle to do because so much work goes into just making the book. So we also work individually with authors on a publicity plan. For example, Alice's book by Julien Gracq. We are in touch with Alice about who do you know who writes about French surrealism, right? Who do you know who is working in modernism more broadly? Those people then can like enter our database via the translator. So that's a way in which we're kind of continually expanding the base of people that we're in touch with about the books. We have generally a lot of French contacts because French is so robustly represented in translation in the United States. But when someone is working from a smaller language or a less translated language, that work actually becomes really crucial. We did a book from Indonesian last year, so that translator has done a lot of work in helping us kind of build out that base of scholars and reviewers, etc. Then the book goes out, and then for a minute, I'm kind of trying to sell the book that's out while also looking at the book that's coming up. And so it's a bit of a juggling game, like all this small press activity usually is. It's a little bit like working at the postal service. I kind of recently remarked to myself, and that there's always more coming in. But um, yeah, it's a lot of correspondence, as Matvei said. It's email and relationships and being a bit of a campaigner, which I think is my Myers-Briggs personality type.
Great, great. And Katie, what's your role in the juggle?
My role in the juggle. I am the development director at World Poetry, and while I did not have the pleasure of working on this book with Alice, I guess Matvei was doing that role as well before I came on. Generally, what I would do is before the publication of the book, I'm corresponding a lot with the translators and lucky enough to be collaborating with them to find funding opportunities, which are spread out. There are often language specific opportunities or funding that comes from the country of the original book, and sometimes also organizations within the United States. So it's matching our translators with potential ways that they can be supported in their work, because it is quite solitary, and there are things happening that perhaps they don't know about, or things happening that they know about that I don't know about. And so we are doing a lot of back and forth to get the book as supported as possible and with the best opportunity to reach as many readers as possible. An extension of that is once the books are published, I'm going and finding opportunities for events, for readings, for speaking engagements at universities, community speaking engagements. That could be with other world poetry author or other world poetry translators, with the author and the translator together, often with poets that are in the same have the same interest or the same focus. And so it's building community on that side as well.
Great. It's interesting that all of you are communicating. That's the job. It's everybody is reaching out and communicating, making community seems to be the network. So I think you have some images of book covers to show us that we'd love to see. So maybe we can, there you go.
So there's Abounding Freedom, which Alice translated. I think we even have a slide of the original. There it is. Yeah, so you can see the way we did it a little differently. I won't say much about this book and James and Katie, feel free to pipe in at any point if I forget or you
Can I
want
say
to
something
add.
about this?
Yeah, Alex.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say I'm so happy with the cover, and I wasn't the one who found this original cover. It was Andrew, and I don't know how he did it, but he's amazing, and I'm just really happy with it. And I just love how the design itself is a translation
Mhm.
of the original. Yeah.
Can we see the first slide, Min? Yeah. So you see it's a little different. I mean, obviously it's not exact, and but stylistically very much part of that world. So there we go. Should we go to the next one? Night. So I guess I'll talk about the covers mainly where they're here so we can kind of say a couple of words about the kinds of books we publish and what we focus on as a press. And many of them, like Moltedo's Night, are the first appearance of a foreign author's work in English. This one translated by Marguerite Feitlowitz. And it's a book written during the dictatorship in Chile, but not published until afterward. We have a bunch of covers to show you, so I'll be brief about each one. James, you might remind us, Marguerite is giving a talk and reading from this book and a talk about it and Chilean poetry in the Pinochet era at Bard NYC coming up. So if you're in New York, you might want to check that out. I forget what date, March
It's March 4th. I just dropped
4th.
the registration in the chat if anyone
Yeah,
wants to take a peek.
Okay, great. All right, next one. George Seferis. This came out in the fall. So again, we're not only interested in writers who've not appeared in English before, but in some writers, poets, new translations of poets who people might be familiar with, like Seferis. This book, though, however, was never translated and includes poems that might change the way some people view Seferis. A lot of political poems, erotic poems, some visual poems, which are unusual, or I had never thought that he had done these kinds of poems. So, and Jennifer Kellogg's translation just won a big award last fall from the Modern Greek Studies. I forget, it's a long name. I don't know, maybe James remembers.
I always have to check.
Yeah,
It's the Elizabeth Constantinides Memorial Translation Prize.
Yeah. So Jennifer did amazing work on this. It's, I think, her first full-length book of translation. And importantly, what we're really focused on is new translations. We're not focused on republishing older work that had been, in older translations. We're really seeking to support especially emerging translators, but translators throughout their, but also established translators with interesting projects. But we're really focused on these on the idea that we're publishing new translation. So what's the next one? Thanks, Min. This is a book that maybe one of our best-selling books, actually, maybe surprisingly, is Joyce Mansour, Arab Jewish poet who wrote in French, who translated by Catherine Fisher, who we collaborate with closely as she is the guest curator for our colloquy series of events, which we'll talk about later. And this book came to me through conversations with Catherine, and then I kind of pushed her to submit a proposal. And again, this is a first book of translation for her, and it is also one of the only time Joyce Mansour's later poems have been collected and translated into English. So a surrealist from the later end of surrealism, I suppose, and whose work is mostly out of print in French, but I think has had a resurgence of interest in English most recently, quite recently. Okay, so next, Min. We've also, we publish books. This is another first book of translation and also a first appearance of in English of Mario Dell'Arco. Barely been published in a few magazines in translation, but Mario Dell'Arco wrote in Romanesco, the Roman dialect of Italian. So we're kind of we're also interested in these kinds of language issues that this book suggests. Was kind of a Pasolini loved this poet. He made little self-published books and sold them on the street in Rome and so forth. So anyway, there's lots to find out about here about a poet no one has ever heard of in the US and hardly even in Italy anymore. So let's go on. This is a book that James read from, Seo Hawk's The Cheapest France in Town. Megan Sung-Yoon was a student of mine back at Columbia like 10 years ago, and in a translation workshop, and she was working on these poems. And when I started working at World Poetry, I wrote to her and I said, whatever happened to that project? Because those were so fascinating. And Seo Jung-hak is a contemporary writer. So we do, I've shown mostly books by dead writers, but we do want to publish, and we do publish contemporary writers, living writers, though I'd say not quite 50%, probably less than half of our books are by contemporary living writers. but around there. And we got to bring Megan and Sejong Hak here last spring for some events with the Korea Society and so forth. This is a totally weird, crazy genre-bending book. Elliot Weinberger wrote about it in the Paris Review recently in a recap of and yeah, it is a sort of, if you want to find something you've never quite read, anything like this, this is the one. Shall we go on? Judith Kiros, translated by Kira Josephson. I heard about Kiros through a friend in Sweden who's a publisher and runs a reading series, and had told me about this book. And Judith was kind enough to send me a kind of draft that she did of her own of part of the book translated into English. I instantly thought, okay, we've got to do this book. Judith is Ethiopian Swedish writer, and we've just had a conversation about publishing, taking on her second book, which will come out in a few years. She got an award for this book, and she's kind of for the new book, and she's kind of a big deal, very young Black Swedish poet who's writing a PhD on Black UK poetry, which sounds, I got to talk to her about that the other day. Anyway, as soon as I found out what this book was, I was like, we got to find a translator. I turned to Kira, and she had not translated poetry before, but she took this on, and they had a great working relationship. So I'm hoping we're gonna, we're gonna work on the next one too.
This O is also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle
Yes.
Award Greg Barrios Prize, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, we're very, very happy with this. Came out in the last fall, and you can see more about it on the site. There's more than I can say. And yeah, let's go on before I start babbling. Chaos Crossing is the first book of Olivia Elias, a Palestinian French language poet who lives in France, though previously lived in Canada. After leaving Lebanon with her family when she was young. And she's a writer who's just started writing in her 60s. And this is based on her first two collections in French. We're probably going to work with Olivia again in a couple of years. Karim James Abu Said, award-winning translator, so great to work with. This came out fall of 23, I believe. So again, a living writer, first time in English. What's next? I should move faster, Cole?
Maybe a little bit, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so Uliana Wolf, who is maybe familiar to some our friends in New York who lived in New York for a while. She's based in Berlin. She's from East Berlin, and this book is also quite a bit about language borders and the permutation of Polish and German along the border. And as you can tell from the title, Kochanie, Today I Bought Bread, translated. No, it's not translated by Volżina Mort. Sorry, that was our mistake probably, but there's an wonderful introduction by Volżina Mort, and it's translated by Grace Nissan, who's a fantastic translator from German. So we were very lucky. This was Juliana's first book, and Yoko Tawada and other people have praised it. And it was her launching pad kind of for what has become an incredible career as a writer, a poet, and essayist. Anyway, next book. I'll read a little poem from this book later. This is a book that came across my desk that almost knocked me over because it just surprised me in every way. It's a book from the early 80s by from 78 or so, right after the Indian emergency, by Leela Darjaguri, translated by Matt Reek, who's translates also from French and as well as Hindi. So an amazing translator to have been able to work with. This is Jaguri's first book in English translation, even though he's had a huge career, and a poet we should have known about. Anyway, there's lots to say. It covers ecology in northeastern India, and also politics. And anyway, so let's go on. Maria de Catrabarb's book is coming out this spring, and she's a fantastic younger poet. She now is the co-manager of Edition Corti, the press that in the 50s put out Julien Gracq. This is her first book in English translation. It's a first book of translation for Aidan Farrell, who translated it. So I won't say more. I would say it has nods to the writing of Lynn Heginian and others that you might be familiar with in U.S. poetry on the avant-garde side. It's a fantastic and strange book, and it's quite a translation feat, I would say. So next book, and this is coming out again, like the previous book, this is coming out, go ahead, Min. This book too is coming out in this May or April. It's Witold Wyrpsza from Poland, who was a writer of the post-war period, never translated into English. So gives you a sense of what we're doing. Dissident writer, fascinating, ironic, sardonic kind of poems. Let's go on. And Gaston Fernandez, brought to us by KM Cassia. When I sent this book for blurbs to specialists in the field of Latin American poetry like Roberto Tejada, he said, "Who the hell is this? I never heard of this guy. Wow. Like, this is an amazing discovery." And KM Cassia has been making those kinds of discoveries as a translator for a little while now. We published his translation of Maples Arce, the great Mexican stridentist of the early 20th century. And this book is a kind of, this author was barely known, kind of a cult figure, Peruvian. Anyway, it's kind of a sequence of 100 psalms. It's beautiful. We're very excited for it to come out. And what do we have next? Amelia Rosselli, who some of you probably in the audience are familiar with. She's kind of of foreign poets, maybe quite well known, of Italian poets of the late 20th century. This book had not been translated before. It's a huge book. It is maybe the longest book we've published. Well, it will be published in the spring. Roberta and Deborah were amazing to work with. It is a very complicated book to translate. They did an amazing job. Amelia Rosselli is a super difficult poet. Here she is basing her work on Petrarch, and yet writing these kind of weird leftist political poems and about love and spurned lovers. And anyway, it's incredible. I'm very excited about this Rosselli book. Next, I think that might be it. Okay. I'll stop there with my pitches for these books, but I hope you get a sense of the kind of work we've been doing, we will be doing, as we are publishing maybe 6 or 7 first books by emerging translators out of the 12 we're publishing this year, and several of those books are from languages that are less represented. A book from Afghani Persian or Dari, a book from Iranian writer in Persian, a book from Arabic, a book from what else? I can't remember now. In other words, we're definitely looking, and in June we have a submission period. In case you're wondering, you can see that stuff on the website if you're a translator and you want to get in touch about an interesting project we'd love to hear from you.
Great. And just looking at the time, I want to make sure that we get to the discussion about the relationship of your own writing to the work that you're doing with the press and how those two dovetail. And maybe we'll start with Katie on that question.
All right. I would say the way that my own writing or my life as a writer and my life as a employee of Poetry Corps of World Poetry intersect would be that I don't have to compartmentalize my life. I think that writing, this is a bit of a cliche, but writing itself is solitary, reading is solitary. And when I'm done with my writing for the day and I move into my work life, it's an extension of what I've already been doing. So it's not having to move into a new arena or it's using different parts of my brain, and that there is a lot of conversation, but it's thinking and working and engaging with the same material that I do for myself when I'm by myself.
Great. I like that idea of just the extension, the fusion there. Nice. James, how about you?
Yeah, my sort of career in publishing has come about pretty accidentally. And I feel similarly to Katie that it, in a way, it's a kind of like more social form of things that I'm already doing and already thinking about. I think I saw Fiona Templeton in the room. I don't know if she's still here, but my first sort of literary nonprofit job was with Fiona as her assistant, as an assistant to the relationship, a theater company. And from there, I moved to Belladonna, who I think has also done one of these sessions, and now I'm at World Poetry. But all along, I think it's been a way for me to be among the living, which is sometimes not a place where I spend a lot of time poetically, to make friends and also to learn new skills. It's kind of started as a way to avoid getting sort of sucked into an academic space, which is the direction that many poets kind of like that track is sort of greased in a way. And I was trying to avoid that for unarticulated emotional reasons. But so I've wound up kind of on the bookmaking side, and it's interesting. There's a lot to learn, and a lot to learn about the kind of materiality of books, which is something that I never really thought much about as a poet. I also hope that it will serve to make me a very easy author to work with when I start to publish my own books, because I know a bit about how the sausage gets made.
And you make chapbooks
Hmm.
also. So the
Yeah, that also was
object of the book
inspiring.
is, yeah.
Yeah.
Great. That's a great analogy. Matvei,
I don't know. I've been doing this too long to have an answer. I translate, I write, I work in publishing, in small presses and creating small presses or building up small presses. I don't I mean, I think everything that Katie and James said sounds true to me. I'm not the kind of writer who really wants to write, actually. Writing is hard. Um, and I do it when I need to or when it seems right. But I'm a little wary of it as a kind of like enticement. It's a little kind of can be a little sort of solipsistic or kind of self-important in some ways that I find a little troubling. And sometimes I get really into it and it's fun, but for the most part, I'm kind of really interested in what literature does in the world. That's how I encounter it. That's how I want to encounter. I want to encounter it in the ways that I am making it, and making encounters for others. So that has been sort of how I've been working for a long time. And writing comes into it, and writing gets influenced and pushed by all of the people I meet, all of the translators I talk to, the writers I'm working with, and the way that really expands how like how I start to think about my own writing. And when I get seriously into a project, all of those voices are very present. And then it provides me with some kind of import for why I'm writing. So.
Yeah, great. Uh, I know you've got some slides of events that will show us that side of the press and its activities. So maybe let's segue into those slides and we'll hear about them. And Katie or James want to tell us what's going on?
I can start with this one because I was here. This was right around the time that Katie was starting. This was colloquy number 11. I should talk a bit about colloquy, which is our event series. We put on 2, sometimes 3 events per season. Really just in which we invite translators to come and read, and then there's a nice kind of substantive Q&A which follows. It's one of, I think, only 2 or 3 reading series in New York that's exclusively devoted to translation. So that's cool. And we've been seeing the audience grow kind of continuously since we started it in fall 22, perhaps. This was the 11th one, which was around translating Korean poetry. Sao Jung-hak and Megan are the author and translator of The Cheapest France in Town, as has been mentioned. So it also functioned as a kind of book signing for them, but we also had Eunice Lee and Steen An and Soje, 3 other translators from Korean on a sort of panel at the Korea Society in Midtown. Very beautiful space.
Colloquy was actually how I first came to know the press, by attending these events. I had classes with Catherine Fisher, the curator, and so as this was coming into being, I started to attend these colloquy events, which kind of positioned me to learn about the press. It's a great series.
And yeah, and each version, if it wasn't obvious, each version is in some way kind of themed. So this was on Korean poetry. We've also done we do an annual version spotlighting emerging translators. We have translating queerness coming up, and we usually partner with a venue that seems to align in some way with the kind of center of that particular program.
And I would say this program also allows us to reach wider audiences, because sometimes it's at the library, sometimes it's at a bookstore, sometimes it's at cultural centers. So you're really getting to talk about translation with people who are coming at it for different reasons, and with different relationships with translation and the books.
I think there are some more slides from this event, and we could go to.
This one is from the Ibrahim
There's the-
Nasrallah event before. Yeah.
You want to go back to this event or the image from the same event?
We could talk about this. This was a book launch last fall in October for Palestinian, a chapbook. We've been doing about 1 chapbook per year in addition to our full-length publishing. Palestinian is a chapbook by Ibrahim Nasrallah, translated by Huda Fakhreddin. And we had this launch at the Poetry Project. That's Katie and our social media manager, Leslie Olivo.
And maybe the next one?
There was a huge crowd, I heard.
Yeah, it was a great event. It's on YouTube. Highly, highly recommended. Ibrahim Nasrallah was an incredible presence, and Huda was doing these kind of magnificent, like on the spot interpretations of his responses to all the answers. It's really something. This was also from the event that we mentioned before. What's next? Another colloquy. Sometimes we partner with presses, and that kind of functions as the theme. So we've done one with New Directions before. This was a partnership with Archipelago Books, with Jennifer Shu, Jacob Rogers, and Kalpana Raina. That's the back of Catherine Fisher's head, who is our curator and who does the Q&As usually. This one was at Brooklyn Public library in partnership with BPL Presents, which is their flagship event series and happens in the Dweck Center, which is that beautiful auditorium downstairs at the Central Branch. Anyone else can jump in too, yeah. Were you going to ask something, Cole?
No, I was going to ask what was next.
Oh, yeah. This is Marguerite Feitlowitz, the translator of Night by Ennio Moltedo, at a program that we put together in collaboration with the CUNY Grad Center on Chilean poetry during the Pinochet dictatorship. Also featuring Esther Allen, who's one of our board members and a champion of the press and an accomplished translator from Spanish. You can do the next one. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, maybe in light of the time, we should go to the upcoming events, the two colloquies, and because I want to make sure that we have time for you to talk about the collaboration and the studio and how that all functions too.
Yeah, these are our two spring colloquy events. On April 23rd, we'll be hosting Curiosifs Julia Sanchez and Jeffrey Zuckerman at the New School in collaboration with the Creative Writing Department there. The topic being queerness in translation. There is not yet an RSVP link for that one, but you could use this moment as a kind of save the date notice. I'll also drop a sign up to our newsletter in the chat before this is over, so you won't miss any such announcements. And then about a month later, colloquy number 17 is going to be at Unnameable Books, our sort of neighborhood bookstore friends, which is where we usually have the Emerging Translators event in the spring, featuring Marine Cornuet, Aidan Farrell, whose translation of The Vitals will have just come out, and Purnaswamy, another emerging translator. Yeah. This one does the 17th colloquy does have an RSVP link that's live, which I can also drop in the chat.
Great. And maybe now on to the studio.
Yes, I'll just keep talking and talking.
Good. Do it well.
Yeah, I'm here in the studio. This is the World Poetry Studio on Bergen Street in Crown Heights. I have been working here for quite some time, since before I worked for World Poetry, because as I mentioned, I had a job at Belladonna for some years, who is right over there. All of the Belladonna books are in the room with me, if there are any Belladonna fans out there. And also in the back corner of the studio are Litmus Press, as well as all the adopted former presses that Litmus now manages, Post Apollo, O Books, etc. We also share the space with a textile artist named Corey Siegler. This is our little lounge chair situation where you can sit and have a coffee. We're very welcoming of visitors. I'm usually here and eager to chat with somebody if no one's around. So if you ever want to drop by. When I got the job with World Poetry, I was doing at first half-time with Belladonna and World Poetry, and kind of as a joke, it occurred to me that maybe we should form a poetry conglomeration, and thereby increase our funding and decrease our overhead, which I at the time dubbed Poetry Corp. And because I'm a kind of a goofy guy, I got a sign made also, which now hangs in this space. So we kind of all affectionately call the space Poetry Corp, but it's kind of coming into like actual fruition. We might start to do a little bit of fundraising as Poetry Corp. So who knows, maybe it will actually happen with this thing that was kind of lightly a joke. And there'll be one big poetry company that we can all work for.
Maybe
the
you
books.
can,
Go ahead.
maybe we can turn off the slides, because then people can see our Poetry Corp thing. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, it's inverted, and this is our kind of display shelf behind me.
Yeah, and Winter Editions is there too. So it's Poetry Corp is huge. It's like a conglomeration for sure.
Do you do any events there?
We've had some pretty fun parties, holiday parties. With Belladonna, there were pretty regularly some readings that would go on, or fundraising events. It's a pretty elastic space in a nice way. Litmus had a book launch for Tracy Morris last year in this space, and um, it, it's not accessible. It's on the fourth floor, and the stairs are very steep. It's in the old Heinz building, so it's kind of built sort of factory style, and it's not easy to get up here, but it can serve during 9 to 5 as an accessible event space. The service elevator.
Great. Well, maybe this is a good moment to turn to the Q&A. So I will turn it over to Min. And thank you very much for all of this really great overview of all that you do. It's really nice. Thanks.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you, everyone. We have two comments which I'm going to read. The first comment I'm going to read first in case you would like to grab your copy, but Laura Mullen has asked if you could read Roselli poem, and I'm not sure if any of you have a copy of that in hand. And
It's
while
not out yet.
Mhm.
It's not out yet, so we don't have any copies. We could probably bring one up. James, you want to bring up the ARC?
Yeah, I can get the ARC up.
But I think it's kind of hard. It's like a one long book of it's a serial poem, you could say. So it's a little tough to choose out of 200 poems. But there are some being published beforehand and have been online and stuff. But Laura, I'm glad you're excited about the book, as I am.
Wow, James.
Okay, I'll read
Did
the first one. Just before I had to leave, I wrote, thereby turning my back on the promise, very beautiful things that only you, with your childish face of a boy forced to be proud, can show me. Yes, in the end, I wrote beautiful things, all of them for you. No audience was more distracted.
Thank you. That's great to have that in the air.
Yeah.
Thank you. The second comment is from Michael. Thank you all for the good work you're doing with world poetry. The CRAC is fantastic, as are the Elias and Mansour books. I need to leave, but I'm making sure we get all of your other books up here in Montreal. Come do an event here.
Thank you.
And our third question is from Fiona. You touched on this towards the end of the conversation, but Fiona would be interested to hear your relationship with the world translation community, other presses, for example, Tilted Axis, other countries, Asymptote.
Sorry, what was the question? Exactly.
Fiona's interested to hear more about your relationship with world translation community in general.
Oh,
Great question. Thank you, Fiona.
that is great. Thank you, Fiona, for being here. Yeah, I think mostly through journals that publish translation, which there are many of, some exclusively or more focused on translation or more focused on world literature. As far as like other translation presses, we've been talking to some like people who are focused on translation, like and other stories about maybe, and some other places in the UK talking about maybe doing collaborations where we publish on both sides. Obviously, we're in touch with a lot of foreign publishers for rights, and we send our books to Circumference Books, for instance, old friends. There are a lot of translation presses that do, or I wouldn't say a lot, but there are several presses that focus on translation, but mostly fiction, transit, and so forth. So mostly or almost exclusively, a lot of them. So of course we are very good friends with Archipelago and New Directions. As we mentioned, we did events for their translators. But as far as the world translation community, it's kind of complicated because not everybody wants to translate into English, right? There's a lot of people we're in touch with who are actually working on translating stuff into other languages. But there's some cross-pollination. There are festivals in Europe, for instance, I've been trying to get some of our writers into. They're,
The
mostly, yeah,
the International Surrealist Society, is that
yes,
what it's called?
some
Like
of our
Catherine
translate.
Fisher? Yeah.
Alice, didn't you go, Alice? You didn't go in the end, but there was a meeting of the International Association of Surrealism or whatever, that where there were talks by I think Kathleen Heil might have gone, who translated our Merritt Oppenheim volume, and Catherine Fisher went to talk about Mansour. But yeah, I don't. That's a really good question. I wish there were more cohesion, perhaps, or like some kind of listserv or something. But U.S. publishing is so concerned with our market issues, which are very particular and different from other places. We mostly are trying to get our books and into bookstores abroad where there are people interested like in a particular language or literature, and we do some of that, but it's very difficult because of distribution issues. But some of our French books are in French bookstores or English language bookstores in France, or ones that do both. For instance, and in other places, we're trying to get more to Latin America and so forth. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing, and mailing, shipping costs, and various distribution problems for, the EU has lots of restrictions. Taxes. It's a huge. So even just getting our books in the hands of people abroad is actually more complicated than it would seem.
Yeah.
Our next question is for me. I've attended one of your events, and it was really, really lovely to hear both like the translated poem, but also to have the poet there. I've attended the one at Korea Society, and I was wondering if like the sonic elements are part of like if you while you're editing and translating, um, are you thinking about like readings in mind, like Alice, while you were translating, like is that something like that you're sort of considering? And how does like readings and events as such inform your writing and editing and translating process?
Maybe I can start off. Sound was a really big consideration in my translation process, especially because, the most difficult thing about translating the CRAC was actually figuring out what was going on and like what kinds of images he was creating. It was really just like understanding how the various elements of the poems fit together. And so I think one of the things that like still creates this sense of a whole is the sound and how lyrical these poems are. And so I think that the consideration of sound kind of helped me construct these poems when I wasn't completely sure what to make of them semantically. But I don't think I wasn't really considering events or like reading these poems aloud. Or yeah, I wasn't really considering events when I was thinking about sound and translating these poems, but it definitely was like a big, like the music of the poetry was one of the big things I wanted to get across.
And Matvei, as a translator yourself, what is your relationship to that question?
To sound.
Yeah.
I mean, it's sort of the most important thing maybe for poetry, right? But sound in a maybe not specifically the spoken moment, but also the how you see it on the page, and can you intimate connections between words in a way that approximates a similar density or of connection or things like that, so that the reader on the page can also hear it. But I mean, events have been, part of the maybe connected to the global translation community. Like, it's great to hear translators read from their work. And we can't have we can't bring back Julian Grach to read from his work, but we can, and that's fine. We don't need to. We actually can do better. Alice can read the translations. It's like a new life of the work and a new sound and a new. It's not going to be the same sounds. It's going to be a different orchestration and like a reperformance of a symphony, right? You don't have to do it the same each time, and but it's really hard to, speaking of the global community thing and the connections between presses and so forth, it's so hard to get translators invitations to places like the Academy. Even, this is a very special what Cole and the Brooklyn Rail have put together with this program for, focusing on small presses and also focusing on those that do translation. This is very special, and there aren't that many opportunities for translators, not to mention translation publishers, to talk about their work, but translation, we can't bring Amelia Rosselli, but to get a gig for the translators, you'd think that everybody would want to hear them, but we have this idea of the real article. And so oftentimes when there's a living writer, we'd love to bring them, but where's the money to bring someone from France or India or Indonesia? And it's certainly not here. I know the Rail can't help us, but we can maybe do it on Zoom. So some of these contemporary writers, luckily, Saw Jung Ha came with Megan Sung-yoon, both came from Korea. We had real trouble. We didn't get the funding we hoped for that. Those events, and those were really important events. And universities, just in libraries in New York, they don't have any money, and the universities just don't want to do it. And that's anyone out there teaching, think about it, that who you need to be bringing to read from incredible works of literature is the translators.
Thank you. That's well said. Any other questions, or shall we go then to our final readings?
I have one last question from Chloe.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for this conversation, which has been such a pleasure to listen to. My question is about the artworks on the covers. I really love the art that you put on the covers of the books, and I'm curious how that's informed by either the translation process or what goes into the selection of the cover.
I guess I'll speak to it because I work most closely with Andrew on our whole design kind of direction, but really Andrew is incredible at, first of all, we're very focused on finding typography that is related to, in terms of time period and country or region, particular aesthetic styles related to the kind of poetry we're publishing. But so if it's for this book of a contemporary Greek anarchist poet, Andrew found type that was used in like anti-fascist Italian and Greek type shops in the earlier part of the century, but modernized it. But sometimes we like buy typefaces from a Chilean typographer who's a current recent, a living designer, in order to, if we're doing a book from Chile, or, highlighting designers from other places is important to us, like type designers. And then like this image was from a contemporary film by a kind of a anarchist filmmaker in Greece. So, but with like a lot of the covers, we're looking for art specifically that is from an artist from the milieu of the poet, who the poet has a connection to, maybe actually personally, or especially historically, like they operated in the same kind of circles, or at least from the same kind of range. I mean, and 2 times we've done like a kind of imitation of the original cover, but mostly we're kind of creating new cover designs that speak to all kinds of things that Andrew finds that that relate specifically to the poet. So he is reading, if not the whole book, he's getting a sense from me. We talk a lot about what the tone of the book is, but also like this sort of specific historical nature or contemporary milieu of the author.
Thank you so much for that answer.
Thank you for asking.
You both. We're going to transition into readings. Katie, if you're ready, we can go into your reading.
Great, thank you. I'm going to read from the Moltedo, which has come up a few times, and so I'm going to plug some events that Marguerite the translator is doing, in addition to the talk at Bard on the 4th of March. She, along with Michael Shea, who has a book coming out this spring, and some other translators will be reading at the New Orleans Poetry Festival, which is in April 12th at 9 a.m. So if anyone is in New Orleans, please come to this breakfast poetry reading. It's a great way to start the day. And for people in New York, we will be having our spring launch on April 30th at Von Bar. Von Bar is a great place, very supportive of the literary community, and we're excited to have a reading there. So I don't think we have a link for that, but April 30th in New York. So I'm going to be reading from the Moltedo, as mentioned, writing during the Pinochet era. And when I was getting ready for this, there was this lovely quote that ended the introduction where he said, poetry often said processes or proposes a new reality. It doesn't get there, but it continually marks the approach. And I thought that was a nice sentiment to kind of talk about what we're doing in our life as writers and bringing books to life. This book is divided into 113 sections, like small prose, we can't see it, but prose poems, and I'm going to read 3 of them. You can stop the charade. Different times, but man still marks his moment with word and deed. Only the horizon knows what will happen from one minute to the next. If the chain of actions will melt into gas and memory, you can relax. We close the curtains, undulations on the sea, and refuse all visits from outside our group. Time has changed us. No one we don't know can appear among us. It is forbidden to trademark the wind or the water. Who is it now who's so agreeable and smiling, offering his hand to the newly minted monster? No one must invite the beast to come share. I'm not exaggerating, our playthings. Nor to have a seat at the table and be feted as we open the windows wide. Its darkness must deepen. We will not allow it to fade, to befoul the space we have always seen expand, stretch freely towards the line of figures and incidents coming towards us from the sea. And then the next one. We thought we were living, growing, but we were only digging for our eternal future. And last, in times of peril and conflict, its subtlest expressions are amplified and its dimensions expand. We're talking about a classical artifact of unquestionable visual aesthetic distinction. To this day, old and young dream of its form, spherical or ovoid, and of its polished black surfaces. Its volume, autonomous and hermetic, reflects equally the light of day and night, but it forcefully holds, the essential secret within. And yet one barely thickened point on its surface is impossible to detect with the naked eye. It alters the center of gravity, and when the object is rolled, its trajectory is impossible to predict. Self-sufficient and compact, the artifact surprises as much for its quietude and age, measurable only in time underground or in aerial seconds, as for the impression it gives of a sudden desire to be free, which it communicates only once. Then the form disappears under sponge and soap, and it's always too late to save it. This development is represented in storms of minutiae and primitive tracings, suns and spirals, confirming with rays and beams, symbols of an advanced technology. Perhaps it's only the light of the end of a century or suppressed fantasies, a bubble that has grown to add a little confusion and justice to the order of space, time, humankind. And now I'm going to read a little bit. I'm actually not a poet. I'm the fiction writer in the organization. So I'm going to read a little bit of something I've been working on. Upon arriving, the sea dark and container ship MSC stacked with colored blocks, red, blue, green, yellow. 3 days and when not behind a cloud, the sun is warm. The sea shimmers in time with birds I've yet to see, the birds that sound too small to be the same birds the people of this island constantly hunt. Bloody wings nailed up for show, splayed, dragged, gutted, fixed across the entries of small, square other homes. Concrete dwellings with found walls, small windows. How can there be light? The barge looms. The barge has lost all color against the sea. It is now empty of all it contained. Form becomes shaded silhouettes, becomes angles, becomes a city, becomes an unreality in the distance. Nothing visible conveys the movement that drained the ship of cargo. Sometimes a bell resounds across the wet harbor and up the rock walls of the tiered farmland to the fireclay terrace, also a container, with empty clothesline, also angles, and fixed clothespins that hold nothing but shadow. A clenched, rumpled terry cloth towel once hung to dry from yellow pegs, allowing the line to rotate pinwheel. Hundreds, if not thousands of people exist there on the ship. 2 people exist here, in this house, with its fireclay terrace. There is nothing connecting us in this moment of rutted mirroring. We are all strangers, we are all transient, we are all on this island that is more than alone, a place where the winds drive people crazy. Spring is coming, is maybe here, which makes it hard to know where to stand on the plowed plot of land. Below, life is pushing through jagged as it does. Every morning the earth, soft and allowing, shows its change. Someone hammers far away, the echo of deadwood carries. Maybe the bell has nothing to do with the boat, but rings from the ancient church in the town that has existed since the Crusades, the parish of St. Peter's Chains. There is the feeling of banishment, the feeling of 2 lazy dogs who treat you like their own, the feeling of a red-frame garage, and the man inside who carefully folds sheets of lace. The white sun sets while it is still high in the sky, bleached from humidity, edges blurring into its surrounding. It is contrast. It is the same. It is an orb of cut glass you can look directly upon. And now Matvei.
Thank you, Katie. It's great to hear that. Kind of bookended for me with the grok in some way. Yeah. Oh yeah. So I'm gonna read. I think I'll read 2 translations of my own, and maybe a poem and something from a World Poetry Book publication. I'm going to read a poem that was just published in Asymptote. It's 3 poems by Osip Mandelstam from 1937. This is a project I've been working on with my friend John High for maybe 15 years, and we're finalizing it. It will come out with Wesleyan in 26, knock on wood, 2026. And this is a poem that just went up online around the inauguration, which one of the poems actually has to do with, from 1937, has to do with, well, it's like kind of a screed about Mussolini coming to power. And so you can look for that on Asymptote if you're interested. But this is a poem, untitled poem from the Voronezh Notebooks of Mandelstam, 1937. Dream arms my Don Valley drowsing, the turtles' field maneuvers are unfolding. Their fleet-footed, agitated armor and curious tapestries of people's folksy chatter. Common words lead me to battle, daily words for the defense of life, of our country earth, where death will fall asleep in daylight like the owl. Amid faceted ribs, the glass of Moscow glows. In obdurate, unyielding Kremlin words, defense is armed with ardent aegis, and battle armor's eyes, brow, and head are gathered there in friendship. The whole earth, all the nations hear the strike, that toll that drops from the choral box. No slave shall be enslaved. The slave will be no slave. The choir sings arm in arm with the tower clock. That was on the eve of the annexation of Sudetenland and the rise of Mussolini, of course, but also the Civil War in Spain. So little context, which, because there's a kind of quote of the Internationale in it, which was the Soviet hymn at the time, the Soviet national anthem. Anyway, I'll read the first poem from that, if I can find it on my desktop. The first poem from this collection that I've been working on of Mandelstamm's. This is from April 1935. Like the previous poem, it's written during his exile in the south of Russia in a town called Voronezh, where at this point he was watching the agricultural, he would walk by the experimental fields of the Agricultural Institute on the outskirts of town. Black earth, utterly black, utterly revered, all finely tilled, all in horse-necked hills, all air and attention, all together a choir of voices, all a crumble, damp clods of my land and freedom. Black almost to a blueness in early plowing, and unarmed labor is grounded within it, 1,000 mounds of the word turned over. Indeed, there's something to the boundless bounded, and still the earth, the blunt end of an axe, an error, no matter how you bow and beg, falling to its feet, a morning clarinet, it chill finches the ear, a rotting flute, it pricks up the hearing. That oily loam on a plow's blade, how fine, how the steppe spreads forth in April's churning. So greetings then, black earth, be gutsy, eyes open. In work, a black-tongued silence, rough spoken. And for time's sake, I'm just going to read a poem by Leela Jaguri, translated by Matt Reek, which came out with World Poetry last spring. This is called Light. This is from the late 70s, I should say. Light. The light that falls from everyone's hands mixes with the earth. It will grow there, and suddenly we will begin to see each other's fatigue, drooping eyelids, stony faces, see the whole big world of the dead, and we'll get up if we want. The light will grow after this conflagration, and through our bodies, we will start to mix with the sky, our words rippling in the wind.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cole and Min and Chloe and Magli and everyone at Brooklyn Rail for having us.
Yes, thank you, Brooklyn Rail, for offering this space to poetry and publishers. It's great.
And
Really.
thank you for all these people who came out. So many familiar folks. It was really great, and unfamiliar folks. And so nice of you to spend time with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Matvei, Katie, James, Alice, and Cole for all your work. We'd also like to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 24 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operation. You can support our work through the link in the chat and join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Stefania Bortolami and Ginevra de Blasio about the history of Bortolami Gallery. And as it is a Rail tradition, you can now turn on your microphones and say goodbye as you leave. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
everybody.
Bye.
It was wonderful.